This was not how I wanted Pride Month to start. I really didn't want to talk about this. And I wish that I would have been okay with not talking about this, because it's put me in a really bad way right now. But to catch people up, in case they didn't hear, Gareth Roberts, who is a science fiction writer of novels and television in the UK, who has worked on Doctor Who previously, both in various episodes of the show proper, as well as being a pretty key component to the first few series of the Sarah Jane Adventures, had a story that he wrote for a printed compilation of Doctor Who stories be pulled. Now, this book hasn't been released yet, so it's being removed prior to publication. And the reason for this, the core reason, there's nuance and stuff, and I know that because I did the research on it, despite the depression it's now put me into to do that. But the core reason is his transphobic beliefs. And I don't think I've ever actually used that word in a video before. Calling anyone anything phobic, I know, can be a very loaded thing. And honestly, I'm kind of already, this early on, I'm dreading the comment section of this video. But to call Gareth Roberts transphobic is not... It's not hyperbolic, it's a statement of fact. The man has made it very clear, and not like in the past, like he put out a statement giving his side of his story getting pulled from this, making it very clear that it is his belief that transgender is not a thing. He does not believe in it. He does not believe that transgender people are what they claim to be. He doesn't believe transgenderism to be real. And while in his official statement he worded that in a more live and let live, sort of we just have a disagreement sort of way, in the past he has not spoken in that manner. Now, to be clear, and because this is worth being clear, it was something he pointed out, and from what I could find, this was accurate. He has never called for the active persecution or of trans people or for violence against them. But he has casually used terms such as tranny, which is generally accepted to be a hate speech term towards transgender people, as well as conflating trans women with confused gay boys. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I really didn't want to talk about it. Partly because a few videos from channels that I subscribe to already have videos out on it. Actually, fairly well done ones. Channel Pup put out one, as well as Mr. TARDIS Reviews, both of which I think are worth seeing. I'll link to them below. But, and honestly, if this hadn't broken during Pride Month, maybe I would have let it sit, but I couldn't. I couldn't not say something. And also, it is my hope that saying this here will allow me to not have to talk about it as I end up coming up to reviews of episodes of Doctor Who that he wrote as I work my way through my rewatch of Modern Era Doctor Who. I've actually already recorded reviews for a couple of episodes of his, and even though that Unicorn and the Wasp hasn't been released yet at the time this video is coming out, I have already shot it, so I definitely didn't mention it there. But I'm not going to mention it in other videos either, because when I review the episodes, I want to review the episodes and not talk about this. So I'm talking about it here, so I don't have to talk about it later. But beyond that, I don't. When I saw the conversations crop up of, basically people taking his side of basically saying this is just some difference of opinion, it's not. His position is that a certain kind of person doesn't exist. There's no compromise to that position. If you're trans, which I am, and if you're new to the channel, I'm not a trans woman. I don't claim to be. I identify as gender fluid, and which gets its own thing of people claiming it's not a thing, but what is very much the case, whether you think there's something wrong with me or not, I have certainly transitioned out of the life of a cisgender male, which I once lived. And the claim of Gareth Roberts is that I am not valid. And aside from the fact that that's not a position that you can actually come to a middle ground with, it's also wrong. I mean, it's demonstrably wrong. At this point in time, saying that there's really no such thing as transgender is, I'm really going to pile up on a fun comment section by making this comparison, but here we go anyway. It is very much the same as saying that climate change isn't real. Because while the specifics and the fine details may not be universally agreed upon, and there's still a lot of research to be done, there is a scientific consensus. Climate change is real. Transgenderism is real. There's still a ton of research being done in terms of what may or may not be factors in causes, from genetics to the environment you're raised in, all sorts of things. And it's worth noting that about a week ago, at time of recording, the World Health Organization voted to remove transgenderism from being classified as a mental health condition. And they are not doing that because of political pressure. They did that because after placing it there, because that's what they thought it was, and then having decades worth of studies to look at and compare, and all this research done on transgender people, they determined, no, we can't classify it as a mental health issue because that is stigmatizing and also incorrect. We now know more because we've been studying it. And so we're going to move it off of that. And also, because it's real. So, it should be very obvious that I wasn't going to be sympathetic to Gareth Roberts' position on this. But what has made researching it depressing to me is people continuing to present it as if it's just a matter of opinion when it is as absurd to claim that transgenderism is not real as saying that there's no such thing as climate change or that the earth is really flat. It is that of that same level. You are not, and what's frustrating is it's always presented like it's the rational. So, I mean, obviously, chromosomes. Don't you remember high school biology? Yeah, I do. which is introductory stuff. And I also know that there is decades worth of PhD level science that has been done to bring a heck of a lot more nuance than high school biology would ever bring to any topic. But that's what makes this depressing for me to dig into. It's seeing the prevalence of that and of people defending him as if what he's saying isn't absurd and hateful. And I will call it hateful. Because even though, again, he does not call for violence or even discrimination against trans people, by perpetuating the lie of transgenderism not being real, he is still contributing to a movement and an element of culture that is calling for violence and persecution and isolation and removal of rights from trans people. So for him to talk about that and to make that claim, which again is demonstrably false, he doesn't have to call for that to still be contributing to the societal elements that are calling for that. But this brings us back to, should he have... See, it's funny, it's being presented as lost his job. He didn't lose his job. And there's a couple things worth pointing out here that, again, I had to pick up through doing additional research on this. The first is the Doctor Who compilation is being released by BBC Books. Now, BBC Books is a subdivision of Penguin Random House, not the BBC itself. So he is not being fired as an employee of the BBC. To the best of my knowledge, he's not an employee of the BBC. He's a freelance writer. He's written on commissioned jobs. He's not a staff writer with them. So this deal has actually, despite the name BBC Books, this actually has nothing to do with them. BBC is simply a branding on it, but it's controlled by another company. He's not being fired because he was already paid, at least so far as I was able to find. If I'm wrong, somebody cite me a source, but from what I could find, he was already paid for this. All that's happening is the story won't be included with the collection. It won't see publication. But he was paid for it. So nothing was stolen from him, not even the opportunity to write the story or the opportunity to get paid for it. It's just now not going to be seen. And in terms of how it happened, this is also worth pointing out, because he made it through his statement, which I'll also link below if you wish to read that, because I want to give you access to the source material on this. I don't want, as much as I believe I've done my homework on this, look at what there is, because I'm not perfect. And if I obfuscate where I'm pulling my information from, then I'm being as dishonest as he is. But he presents it as if there was a social media outrage that cost him his job. But again, he didn't lose his job. A piece of his work is not going to be published. But what actually happened was that it is true that the fact that he had a story that was going to be included leaked, and that led to an outcry. The outcry wasn't social media. It's actually other writers whose stories were going to be part of that compilation, because, the various writers assigned to it didn't know who else was working on it, didn't know who else was contributing. And there was a collection of writers, at least a few of whom have spoken publicly and openly about this, who said that once they found out that Gareth Roberts had a story that was going to be included, they contacted BBC Books and said, if you are including his story, do not use mine. I do not want mine to be printed alongside his. And I don't have a count for how many of them there were, because not all have spoken publicly, but it was, it was more than one. And it was that pressure, and along with your usual corporate doesn't align with our values line, that you get, because, like, I'm not going to go to bat for BBC Books. But that was their explanation. So there was pressure put on, but it wasn't a social media pressure. And even though a lot of this stems from tweets he's put out, again, the actual removal of his story is because of his peers. So this is not like James Gunn, where somebody dug through his Twitter to find years old stuff to try and smear him with. This was his peers who were well aware of his views, that just when they heard his name, they said, oh, wait a minute. So ultimately, people are going to know as to whether or not I feel that was the right thing to do. And honestly, I had hoped that I would come to a firmer conclusion on that. But I don't know. Because I don't feel like going to bat to anybody in this story. I will cop to empathizing with Roberts to the extent of I have had the misfortune to be in employment situations where my views in general were at odds with those of my employer. So I know that that's uncomfortable. But that's a very small amount of empathy I'm prepared to give towards him, because, as I said, he's not actually a staff employee at BBC Books or the BBC. He's a contract writer. And so he knows who he's taking these jobs from whenever he takes them. Me, when I've been in that position and jobs, I needed the job. I didn't have the option of turning down a contract. I needed the work. And maybe he does too. I don't know his financial situation, but when you're working on a contract by contract basis, you have a lot more control over who you work for. But here's what I will say. Had this story broken and it was just a matter of the concern over his work being included was still bubbling, like if we hadn't jumped to the end and it wasn't already decided that his story wasn't going to be included, I probably wouldn't personally be calling for his dismissal or the removal of his story. I wouldn't have requested that. And I know that some people will always say you gotta judge the art separate from the artists, and I've talked about that, and I might have to devote a fuller video to that at some point, but had the work still been published, I wouldn't have called for the removal of his story. I wouldn't have said that people should boycott it, but I sure as heck wouldn't have paid money for it. I wouldn't have contributed to anyone financially benefiting from the work of someone who believes that I and others like me is invalid and less than human. Because think for just a second, what if he had said this about any other group? What if he'd said this about a race? What if he'd said this about a religion? What if he'd said it about women, cis women? I'm not going to say no one would be jumping to his defense, but far fewer would. It would just be the far-right people who say, you should never apologize, who would be jumping to his defense, instead of a lot of middle ground people who are going, oh, just live and let live. Because when your position is that a certain kind of person doesn't exist, that's not live and let live. You're denying personhood. You're denying validity. And again, there is a scientific consensus that transgenderism is real, is quantifiable, and is not a mental disorder. And it leaves me in a bad place to have it reaffirmed, because I know this, but that the transgender community is the current acceptable punching bag. 5 years ago, the gay community still was, which is frustrating because Gareth Roberts, I might have said that earlier too. I'm really been paranoid about that. Gareth Roberts himself is gay. So he should have a perspective for knowing what it's like to be told, no, that's not real. You're making a choice. That's not a fact of you. That's something you're choosing to do, being thrust at him and used to invalidate him. Because, like I said, 5 years ago, it was gay people. And before that, it was non-white races. Said to just be naturally biologically inferior. And you go back far enough, not even necessarily human. And I know that trans people are the acceptable group currently to be making these arguments with, because most conservative ease off gays after, or at least in the US, after gay marriage became the law of the land. So now it's me. And people like me. And I don't have a final point. I just needed to talk about this because not talking about it felt wrong. And I'm not looking forward to the comments on this. Those are my thoughts about it. If you're still here and you have thoughts to share and you can do it respectfully, drop something down in the comments and let's try and talk about it. There's other stuff to do as well. There's Patreon to support this channel. You can like, subscribe, and all of it helps. But you also don't have to do any of it. Because at the end of the day, folks, you are beautiful, you are loved, you are valid, you are the council. I just run the meetings. So until next time, this council is adjourned, and I'm going to watch She-Ra and pep myself up.